Right, we're live.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the Heritage Talks online series. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm a project director for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, otherwise known as QAHN. And I'm joined today by Glenn Patterson, whose voice you've just been listening to, who's also one of QAHN's project directors. I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you about QAHN. We are an organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular of Quebec's English-speaking communities spread right across the province. And you're welcome to become a member. We would love it if you became a member, actually. Membership is open to everyone, including community groups and heritage organizations. So please go to our website to check that information out at QAHN.org. For more information about us, our many projects, and to discover the organizations that are right across our great network in Quebec. Members will receive our wonderful little publication called Quebec Heritage News, which is filled with well-researched articles and images, some never published before. And it's all about Quebec's English-speaking heritage. I would like to thank our funders who helped make this series possible, including Canadian Heritage, the Secretariat for Relations with English-Speaking Quebecers, the Chalkers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. The Heritage Talks online series has a super lineup of researchers and writers and historians, and you can discover the presentation dates and times of broadcast on Heritage Talks Facebook page or by going to QAHN's website. And you can join the talks either through the Facebook Live page, and you don't have to have your own Facebook page to do that. It's a public site. Or you can go to the Facebook page and click on the links to join by Zoom. And it's very easy. You just click and pre-register, and then you can be part of our Zoom audience. I wanted to let you know too that we'll be accepting questions at the end of the speaker's presentation. And Glenn has explained it a little bit to some of you already, but you can come out of the hidden mode and put your video on and unmute as well. In order to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, or just go old school and wave your hand. That's probably what I would do. And if you're on Facebook Live, you can type your questions into the Facebook comments section, and Glenn will ask the questions on your behalf. Well, let's get started. I'm really pleased to present to you this evening Grant Myers. Grant received his academic training in anthropology and archaeology at Carleton University and the University of British Columbia. He now serves as the president of QAHN and is a manager with CDEC, the Community Economic Development and Employability Corporation. His interests include social history, ethnohistory, experimental archaeology, folklore, writing, wilderness canoeing, and mountaineering. And Grant is coming to us tonight from Austin, Quebec, and his talk is called Mr. Allbee Comes to Canada. Hi, Grant.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
Good, thank you, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Thank you.
I'll turn the proceedings over to you now, and I will put myself on mute, and the evening is yours.
Great. May I ask a quick question first? Can you hear me well, and can you see me well?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
You're good to go.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The Rose Cemetery in Stanstead County is one of a number of small cemeteries scattered throughout the rural landscape of Quebec's Eastern Townships. I first visited this cemetery over a decade ago when I was doing research on an epidemic which ravaged New England and southern Quebec in the first decades of the 19th century. And I was investigating the graves of 5 children from one family that had died of what was then known as the spotted fever over Christmas in 1814. At some point during my visit, my attention was drawn to another grave from a much later period, that of Mr. Eleazer Allbee, a Vermonter who died in Stanstead at the age of 79 on August 28, 1864. While his headstone was, well, for the most part, nondescript and modest, the epitaph described, or rather inscribed thereon, was truly remarkable. And I'll read it. He went into voluntary banishment from his beloved native country during the reign in the third year of the misrule of Abraham I. In the following years, I'd entertained the idea of building a research project around Mr. Allbee. Anyone making such a bold statement in death had to have had a life worth investigating. The project sat in my idea book until last November, when Heather Darsh contacted me to see if I would like to participate in QAHN's Heritage Talks online series. That is how I find myself speaking to you tonight. This evening, I'll reconstruct for you what is known about the life of Eleazer Allbee and the deeply held convictions that led him to self-imposed exile in Canada. I will also situate Mr. Allbee's story within the broader narrative of American political history, and more specifically, the debate surrounding the legitimacy of the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. I've used a number of primary and secondary sources to build this presentation. For the basic details of Eleazer Allbee's life, I've relied strongly, but not exclusively, on the history of the town of Rockingham, Vermont, written by Lyman Simpson Hayes and published in 1907. I've also consulted a number of Vermont newspapers of the Civil War era, particularly the Bellows Falls Times, which served Rockingham and adjacent towns between 1856 and 1965. I am fortunate that during the pandemic, I was also able to access other sources and a wealth of digitized historical documents, available online, of course. However, there remain a number of primary sources archived in the United States that I have not been able to access and will remain out of reach until cross-border travel is again a possibility. Until I'm able to consult these sources, I should warn you that this project should be considered a work in progress. The Allbees are an old New England family that settled in North America in the 17th century. Benjamin Allbee, probably of County Norfolk in England, was the first progenitor of the American branch of the family, arriving in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, sometime prior to 1640. Eleazer's father, Ebenezer, was born in Townsend, Massachusetts in 1743, and came with his wife Rachel to Rockingham in about maybe 1770, 1771, and settling in an area called the Upper Meadows. It is noted in the history of Rockingham that he changed the spelling of the family name after his arrival, adding an extra I and perhaps another E. As is the case with so many surnames, the spelling of Allbee appears to have been quite mutable over the years, but it is curious that this change was deliberate enough to have been noted in the historical record. We may speculate any number of reasons for this change, but anything nefarious or untoward is probably unlikely. Ebenezer was, from what I can deduce, a moral and religious man, and served as the deacon of Rockingham's Congregationalist Church. Ebenezer Allbee was also a veteran of the American Revolution, serving in the Vermont militia under Captain Jonathan Holton. There is a notarized letter that attests to Ebenezer's involvement in the engagement to repel a small force of Mohawk warriors and British regulars that attacked and burned several communities in Vermont's White River Valley in October of 1780. History remembers this event as the Royalton Raid. The letter was written by Ebenezer's third son, his namesake in 1804, claiming a veteran's pension on the behalf of his father. So let's return to Eleazer. Eleazer was the youngest of 10 children born to Ebenezer, Albee and his wife. Coming into this world less than 2 years after the Treaty of Paris ended officially the Revolutionary War, Eleazer was part of the first generation born into the hopefulness and promise of an independent America. This fledgling nation had rid itself of an autocratic colonial government that ruled on behalf of a monarch that lived half a world away and had never set foot on American soil. It should be noted at the time, technically, that Vermont was an independent nation, but they had participated in the revolution and would be admitted to statehood a few months before Eleazer celebrated his 6th birthday. We know nothing of the details of Eleazer's childhood, but as an adult, he was said to be broad-minded and honest. He was also recognized as one of the leading men of the town, held many offices of trust, and we are told that citizens looked up to him, or rather looked to him for advice and counsel. He was for at least a time a school teacher, said to be skilled in mathematics, and served as a constable for the town of Rockingham in 1818 and 1819. He represented his community as a member of the Vermont State Legislature in 1822 and 1823, and was a delegate to the state's constitutional conventions of 1822 and 1836. The records of these conventions demonstrate that Eleazer was contrary-minded in relation to a number of the proposed constitutional amendments brought forth at both conventions. This perhaps gives us a glimpse of a mind that tended to be critical and conservative by nature. Eleazer was also on the state senatorial ticket of 1842, but did not win his seat. It is interesting to note that while Eleazer was quite active in Vermont politics and Vermont constitutional affairs, there is no evidence that he participated actively in federal politics. This may be a product of a preference for state rather than national politics, or merely a product of opportunity. We just don't know. The record is pretty quiet about this. Of Eleazer's family life, we know very little. In 1804, at the age of 19, he married Hepzibah, and I'll have a hard time with this, Hepzibah Bancroft, daughter of Captain James and Lucy Bancroft. Together, they had 9 children before she passed away in 1833. There is no record of Eleazer remarrying after her death. Like many rural Vermonters of his age, he owned a farm, and his was located on the north side of the Williams River, about 1/2 mile from its juncture with the Connecticut. The history of the town of Rockingham informs us that Eleazer sold his farm in August of 1861 and went to Canada, where he died 3 years later. We are told that this move was occasioned by his conviction that the United States was committing a great sin in the prosecuting of the Civil War. While Eleazer may well have sold his farm in 1861, the assertion that he came to Canada in that year is probably erroneous. His epitaph, the text of which he was said to have been drafted by him prior to his death, suggests that he went into exile during the 3rd year of the reign of Abraham I. This, of course, is a reference to Abraham Lincoln, who was inaugurated as President of the United States on March 4th, 1861. Well, what this indicates is that Mr. Albee did not come to Canada until 1864 and likely arrived here no earlier than late winter of that year, only to die the following summer. The fact that Eleazer made the decision to come to Canada is really no mystery. Thousands of deserters, draft dodgers, political dissidents, rebel operatives found their way to our country throughout the course of the American Civil War. In fact, a full 900,000 of the $5 million appropriated by the Confederate government in 1863 for covert operations was earmarked for Canada. That's almost 1/5. These funds were not only allocated to build support for the rebel cause among Canadians, but to recruit and organize activities in support of the war effort among the sizable population of American expatriates. While there is no evidence to suggest that Eleazer Allbee was involved in rebel activities, either in Canada or in the United States, his political views would have stood at odds with most Vermonters, who overwhelmingly supported Lincoln and the war effort. The young Republican Party easily carried Vermont with over 75% of the popular vote in both 1860 and 1864. If the heated rhetoric in the newspapers of the period is any indication, anti-Lincoln Vermonters, like Eleazer Allbee, would have been subject to scorn, derision, harassment, and possibly even some violence. This was an era before the secret ballot, so vocal or not, one's political beliefs were a matter of public record. This is also a time when physical altercations associated with election campaigns were commonplace. a reality likely exacerbated by the heightened tensions surrounding the Civil War. In towns including Rockingham, armed groups of citizens were formed to counter any threat, real or imagined, and it is not difficult to surmise that dissenters like Mr. Allbee were viewed with much suspicion and watched closely. Life in the United States had clearly become unbearable for Eleazer Allbee when he decided to move the 150 miles north to Stanstead County, Quebec, Canada East at the time. The decision to migrate to Stanstead was probably motivated by the simple fact that he had family there, a source of both social and economic support. Over a half century earlier, Eleazer's older sister Sarah and her husband Timothy Rose had settled in the county, eventually acquiring a farm on Lot 6 of the 12th Range, known as a concession for those of you that are joining us from outside of Quebec. By 1864, both were deceased, but their youngest son, George Henry Rose, lived on the family property. There can be no doubt this is where Eleazer spent the last months of his life. His final resting place, the Rose Cemetery, is in fact situated right on an adjacent property. If I can say, it would probably have been literally steps from the old farmhouse on the property. In many ways, Eleazer was a man of his times, but his opposition to Lincoln in the Civil War clearly stood on the wrong side of history. Was not Lincoln the president that led the northern states in their defeat of the rebellious South, kept the nation together, and emancipated millions of Americans that lived in slavery? This is, of course, true, but what is not true is the myth that the people of the North were firmly united in this effort. Dissidents like Mr. Allbee were not political outliers, or at least not to the extent that the textbook versions of the Civil War would have us believe. Throughout the conflict, there existed a sizable number of men and women in the northern states that opposed the war for a wide variety of reasons. And the arguments of most, like those of Eleazer Allbee, were based on what they understood to be moral or constitutional grounds. In order to better understand the Northern opposition to Lincoln in the war, we need to first understand three dimensions of the political debate that have run like a live wire through the course of American history, from the time of its founding to the present day. The first is a tension and debate about the balance of individual rights, individual liberties, and states' rights in relation to the limits of federal power. The second is really a product of the first, is a fear of tyrannical rule. And you see here pictures of various presidents, George W. Bush, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Martin Van Buren, and that would be Timothy Roosevelt. And I could have added probably a dozen more of these images. Most presidents at one time or another have been accused of tyranny and accused of overstepping the limits of their office as dictated by the Constitution of the United States. And it was no different with Lincoln. The third dimension that I want to mention is race. This dimension is best expressed as the question of slavery, or at least that was how it was framed in the pre-Civil War era. And that's how that's the anchor around which I'm going to discuss that subject this evening. This is probably a good time to apologize to any political or constitutional historians that are with us this evening and may accuse me, rightly so, of making some broad generalizations. My excuse is that I do not want detail to get in the way of a good story. So please bear with me. In the closing decade of the 18th century, statesmen like John Hamilton, John Adams, and others invested heavily in the machinery of the federal state. They argued for the expansion and consolidation of federal powers. This was perhaps driven by the ongoing excitement of a young nation and a desire to stimulate the national economy after the post-war recession of the 1780s. Measures like the establishment of a national banking system, the US Supreme Court, a standing army, and federal trade tariffs were understood as ways to strengthen the economy, enable the United States to look after its interests on a global stage, and promote national unity. This vision for America, however, alarmed some political rivals, most prominently Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who felt strongly that Hamilton and his compatriots were taking license with a constitution that put clear limits on the authority of the federal government. Jefferson and company believed that while the federal government should play a vital role in areas of national interest, such as foreign relations, it nevertheless should remain small and relatively powerless, especially in relation to domestic affairs. They argued that the responsibilities and prerogatives of governance, at least as far as it related to the lives of most Americans, should rest with state and local authorities. Underlying this divergent vision of American democracy was the fear that concentrating too much power at the federal level, particularly in the executive branch, that is the office of the president, would undermine individual liberties and state sovereignty and lead to the kind of despotic rule that they had fought a war to remove. The Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, said to have been drafted secretly by Thomas Jefferson, well, and if they weren't, he certainly played some role in their creation, underline clearly the commitment by Jefferson and his followers to the principle of state sovereignty. These resolutions made the argument that states had the right to examine critically all federal laws and statutes and reject those that they deemed unconstitutional and detrimental to their interests. Further, the resolutions asserted that there was nothing in the US Constitution that denied a state the right to secede, and that the withdrawal from the Union was an option in cases of unresolvable conflict with the federal government. These resolutions, at the time they were written, gained no favor in the other 14 states, and the permanency of the Union has been subsequently reinforced by multiple Supreme Court rulings. Nonetheless, the arguments contained within the Kentucky Resolutions and Jefferson's vision of American democracy would shape the political views of a generation and play a key role in the debate about the legitimacy of the Civil War. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, politics in America evolved around, and I really say evolved because it was a lot of change, evolved around these two conflicting visions of a nation. One that supported the expansion and consolidation of federal power, often called Hamiltonian democracy, and one that favored a more decentralized form of union, that is Jeffersonian democracy. And the politics of the time, I should also say, was an alphabet soup of parties, mergers, splits, and shifting affiliations that can make any summary a daunting task. Again, at the risk of generalizing, I will try and navigate at least the big lines for you. The Federalist Party, established in 1791, led the charge for a strong central US government in the early years of the 19th century. Support for the Federalists collapsed by the 1820s, and the Federalist banner was taken up by the National Republican Party, then later the Whig Party, and finally the Modern Republican Party, which was formed in 1854 and came to power under Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election of 1860. So that was one side of the equation. The Democratic Republican Party, not to confuse you, was founded in 1792 in opposition to the Federalists. The party split in 1828, one faction supporting successful presidential candidate Andrew Jackson, and the other incumbent John Quincy Adams. This split was the genesis of the modern Democratic Party, a party at the time that adhered more or less to the notion that big government was antithetical to the full expression of state and individual liberties. And I think we've heard a lot about that already. The other faction in the split, the National Republican Party, favored what one might argue was a softening of Jeffersonian ideals and the achievement of a balanced approach to the distribution of federal and state powers. Just to confuse matters, this party is the same entity referenced in the preceding paragraph as the antecedent to modern Republicans. So, really, what we saw was in that situation of splitting and joining and all of these kinds of things was the formation of the two primary parties that exist in America today. And I told you things could get a bit confusing, but here's what you have to remember. Two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, contested the United States federal election of 1860. Each had emerged from two distinct visions of a nation and its future. So if we can remember that, we're good. By the 1850s, it's estimated that roughly 4 million Black Americans were enslaved, living in appalling conditions of forced servitude and denied the basic rights and freedoms of US democracy. Well, slavery had been a contentious issue since the founding of the nation. The debate really began to heat up in the late 1830s. The newspapers of the day, depending on their perspective and location, put forth vigorous arguments for and against the practice. Slaveholding had been outlawed in the northern states by that time, but the question about the status of slavery in the new states and territories associated with westward expansion remained a very contentious issue. Adding to the flames were claims by Southern politicians that Northern abolitionists were stoking the flames of rebellion. John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in October of 1859 only added to Southern anxiety, which reached a fevered pitch with the election of Lincoln. Many Democrats also opposed slavery, although the consensus within the party was far from universal. This is evidenced by the fact that the party actually fielded two candidates in the election of 1860, the presidential election of 1860. The first, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, ran for the office as a Southern Democrat, throwing his support firmly behind the agitated slave states. Stephen Douglas of Illinois ran as the other Democratic candidate, but his position on slavery seemed to be ambiguous at best. I think this is clearly an attempt to placate Democrats on both sides of the slavery debate. It did earn him just shy of 30% of the popular vote in the 1860 election, but also the status of an also-ran. Alarmed by Lincoln's win and fearing that Republicans would try and pass immediate legislation making slavery illegal in all US states, 11 states seceded from the Union between December 1860 and April 1861. These states would quickly join together to form the Confederate States of America. Reaching back to the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, the members of the Confederacy argued that slaveholding was a cornerstone of their economy, and that their citizens had the right to hold slaves, and this was protected by the principle of state sovereignty. If the federal government response to this demand was intractable, then it was their prerogative to leave the Union. Well, we know what this led to. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter on April 11th, 1861. And the next 4 years would see a desperate struggle between the forces of the Union and the Confederacy at the expense of 750,000 lives. I have to keep up with my PowerPoint. In 1860, the Democrat Party was coming apart. Southern Democrats had, for the most part, departed the Union. Kentucky and Missouri remained, but Democrats in those states made no secret of their Southern sympathies. Northern Democrats that supported the war were known as war Democrats. These people politicians may not have liked Lincoln, but they saw no alternative but forced to bring the Southern states in line and back in the Union. Northern Democrats that opposed the war and wanted an immediate end to hostilities were known as peace Democrats, or more derogatorily, Copperheads. This appellation suggested that they were like poisonous snakes, undermining the war effort with their venomous words and traitorous thoughts. And we can see on the screen some images related to the Copperheads. We see Columbia, and she's the precursor of what we know today as Lady Liberty in America, fighting off the dangerous snakes of Copperheadism, to preserve the Union. We see another image below below that, where a soldier returning injured from the war is being told by the Copperheads that he only has himself to blame for his injuries because he supported an unjust war. And up in the upper corner, you can see a token, and that token was actually a token made by the Copperhead movement, the Peace Democrat movement. And they, to a certain extent, embrace this image of being called Copperheads, and created these tokens so that they could recognize each other. It was kind of like wearing a ribbon on your lapel to announce your allegiance to one party or another. But in Vermont, Copperheadism was, and Peace Democrats were really a minority, and I had mentioned that already. Abraham Lincoln had, as I said before, had won 75% of the popular vote in 1860. He did it again in 1864, and Vermont was firmly Republican. This animosity also played out at the level of state politics. So in reference to the Vermont governor's election of 1863, the Bellows Times, Eleazer's local newspaper, urged loyal citizens to get out and vote. An editorial published on August 21st of that year stated, "A vote for the Union candidates, i.e. the Republicans, will demonstrate that the state is not indifferent even to the rebel sympathizers at home, who are the meanest, most sneaking, and contemptible of all our country's enemies." The Copperheads, for their part, rejected Lincoln and his war for a number of reasons, most related to what they believed was the tyrannical overreach of executive powers. Some vehemently pleaded that Lincoln could not be trusted because his actions and words were demonstrably contradictory. They said that on one hand, he disavowed the unchecked use of executive powers. On the other hand, he exercised them liberally to achieve his political objectives. As the war dragged on, the list of Copperhead grievances against the president grew longer, and they included the imposition of a national income tax in August of 1861, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and the imposition of martial law in 1861, expanded in 1863, enabling the arrest and indefinite detention of anyone suspected of treason or impeding the war effort. There was also the suppression of lawful protests and press freedoms. And so the press of the day were frustrated by the fact that the federal government was taking steps to suppress news about the war, especially if it was going badly for the Union. The Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862 allowed the federal government to seize property from civilians in the rebel states, but also of any citizen in the US that was suspected of helping the rebels. The Conscription Act of 1863, which imposed the draft on all men of serviceable age, unless they were wealthy enough to buy their way out or provide a substitute, was particularly contentious. And this was an affront to those that believed in the equality of all citizens. And this fueled anti-draft riots in New York and Boston. Copperhead organizers in some states, including Vermont, advised conscripted men to simply ignore the draft or desert after enlistment. And desertion was certainly rife within the Union Army by the third year of the war. Most Peace Democrats were also strongly in favor of maintaining slavery where it already existed, particularly if this meant restoring harmony to the Union. Others thought that the rebel state should simply be allowed to leave and to do what they wished, if that meant the end of hostilities. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, delivered on January 1st of 1863, was universally viewed by the Peace Democrats, again, Peace Democrat, Copperhead, you can call them what you wish, as a political travesty that would only serve to prolong an unnecessary war that was leading to mounting debt and loss of life. In reality, Copperhead arguments against emancipation were reflected a variety of motivations. Some were clearly motivated by deeply held racist views, arguing that slavery was acknowledged in the Constitution, and that was the end of the matter. Others were simply indifferent to the plight of the country's enslaved population, suggesting that they would support slavery if maintaining it meant an end to the war. And there again is a report in the Bellows Times Chronicle, the Bellows Falls Times of March 1863, that states one of the leading Peace Democrats in Maine's legislature, this person remains unnamed, said that he would even consent to have slavery established in Maine if it was necessary to preserve the Union. And so you can see how some of these views were pretty extreme, even for the day. Others, however, were less extreme and simply thought that the president's proclamation of emancipation contravened the privileges of state sovereignty and could not be imposed unilaterally. By that logic, violation of the US Constitution was a greater evil than the enslavement of millions of Black Americans. Slavery could end, but its demise should not be imposed by the federal government, but should happen in a manner that respected the sovereignty of states and the rights of states to decide their own internal affairs. To us, this may seem to be a bit of a disingenuous argument, but for many Peace Democrats, it appeared to have been a sincere, if not somewhat troubling assertion. One of the leading Peace Democrats in Vermont was Timothy Parker Redfield. He ran twice unsuccessfully for the governorship of the state in 1863 and 1864. And I don't know if it works that way now, but certainly in that period, Vermont replaced its governor every year. Most newspapers in the state reveled in what they saw was Redfield's hypocrisy. Earlier in his life, Redfield had been a supporter of the short-lived Free Soil Party. This was a pseudo-national party that had opposed the expansion of slaveholding in the American West. Now he stood arguing to maintain the practice of slavery on the grounds of constitutional fealty. A leading newspaper of the day summed it up like this: "Which is a true man, Mr. Redfield, in times of peace denouncing slavery as the offspring of fraud and the child of physical force? Or the Mr. Redfield who today is bringing all the batteries of his rhetoric into play against the government when it is at last struggling in the death grapple with the gigantic treason sprung upon the nation?" So as you can see, it was a nation divided, even in the North. There can be no doubt that Eleazer Allbee in his day would have been branded a Copperhead. He was almost certainly a Democrat, although concrete evidence for this is slim. It's worth noting that the archival records related to the Vermont Democratic Party of the 19th century, particularly those pertaining to membership, appear not to exist. I'd actually phoned down to the Democratic Party in Vermont in January, and they pretty much told me that they had no archives from the 19th century for whatever reason. So far, I've only been able to find one piece of evidence to suggest that Eleazer was an active member of the party. In the July 21st, 1837 edition of the Windham County Democrat, There is a list, and Windham County was the county in which Rockingham, Vermont is situated. There's a list of delegates who attended a local Democratic convention in the village of Fayetteville on July 8th. As the event was concluding, the reporter scrambled to record an incomplete list of the delegates, and among them was an E. Albee. Now, I'm not entirely certain that that is our E. Albee, but I could only find two others in that area at the time. One was Eleazer's brother, Ebenezer Jr., and he seemed to have taken absolutely no interest in politics. And the other one was an Ellery Allbee, and he was a noted Whig and probably would not have been caught dead in a Democratic convention. So there you have it. The evidence for the only concrete evidence for Eleazer Allbee's association with the Democratic Party. To me, Eleazer Allbee appears as a tragic figure. You know, I see him as an elderly man of fierce convictions, loyal to a vision of America that was no longer tenable, if it ever was. America was changing, and I just feel that he just wasn't changing with it. As the United States, progressed through the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, I can't imagine it growing as a nation and prospering as a nation without a firm, strong federal government. But there were people at the time, like Eleazer, that believed that the federal government in the U.S. should go back to where it was at the beginning. As I said, earlier, relatively powerless and with few authorities related to the governance of the people of the nation. Anyway, that's what it was. And again, what if his voluntary banishment to Canada? Was his banishment really that voluntary? I asked myself that question. Maybe his beliefs led him to fear more than local scorn and ballot box fisticuffs. In May of 1865, in the last days of the Civil War, John McKeough, general ticket agent of the Rutland and Washington Railroad, was arrested in Rutland, Vermont, under the order of General John Dix on a charge of disloyal sentiments and practices. Of that incident, an editorial in the Caledonian of St. Johnsbury observed, "We must say that we understand that McKeough was the same man who telegraphed T.P. Redfield some months ago. The telegraph said, 'Go to Canada.'" Thank you.
Grant, that was marvelous. Thank you very much for a presentation of a very complicated political landscape in 1860s America. I'm so impressed how you unpacked that for us. It's marvelous. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Heather. I felt I was stumbling over my words a bit, but I hope that I constructed a coherent narrative for those that were kind enough to join us this evening.
Oh, for sure. It's a part of American history that I don't know very much about, but I can picture the Fenians running all around in the background of that landscape. So it's I can't imagine everybody must have had such a strong opinion at the time of how America was forming. So, and you really revealed that for us.
Definitely. And, if I can say that, this is an uncomfortable truth, but there was a lot of sympathy for those that opposed the war, and in some cases for the South that existed in our country at the time. I want to leave room for questions, but I'll say this quickly. This is just another example about how the history of our nation is so tied to the giant of the South. And I read recently that somewhere in the neighborhood, perhaps even more than that, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 Canadians went down to fight. Most of them Union, but some of them fought for the South in the conflict. So I'll be quiet now and let people ask questions and make comments.
Right, let's get it open. If you have a question, you can start your video and unmute yourself. And there may be some questions in the Facebook feed as well. And I'll ask Glenn if there's any questions there.
We do. We have one from Lorraine O'Donnell here. Let me just open up here. Lorraine from Questgrin asks, do you think that Mr. Allbee and others with his political views who came up to Quebec may have influenced the Quebec political culture?
It's really interesting that you say that, and I almost brought that into my paper, Lorraine. That's such a great question. I really do feel that we had a whole, again, that generation of Americans that came up, and so either like Mr. Allbee in the middle of the 19th century, but more importantly, at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century, particularly in the border counties along the American border. And I really do have a feeling that the attitudes of those communities and that sense of independent mindedness and reluctance to engage in and I want to put this delicately, what some would call the consensus around the solidarity of Quebec around a number of issues is related to that sense of that sense of individual liberty and that sense of I'll look after myself, thank you, that so many of the early American settlers to this region brought with them. I hope that answered your question.
Very good. There is another one on Facebook from Vicky Onufriu, and she asks, did you find out what were his positions towards early events during the antebellum era, like perhaps his position towards the anti-slavery movement? Did he think it would become a reason to get the slave owners in the southern states angry, or things even about the Underground Railroad? Do we have any evidence about other views he had from correspondence or anything like that?
We do not, but I'm really excited. One of the I could find in none of the papers that I was able to find online, and again I'll tell you I was stuck to what I could find, primary documents that I could find online, and I'm really excited that the Library of Congress has digitized so many papers from the early history of America. But there was one in particular, the Bellows Falls Argus, which was decidedly Copperhead in its outlook, and it was published from the mid 1850s to somewhere around 1865. And I'm hoping that when I get a chance to go down to the States and dig around in the archives, I'm hoping that I'm going to find the Holy Grail, and that may be a letter to the editor or something of that nature that Mr. Allbee or one of his compatriots had written to one of these publications that were sympathetic to their cause, or even better, if I can find in some archive down there some listing of some holding of private correspondence. I did go and look. Again, I said I looked in tried to find some early documents related to the Vermont Democratic Party. I also thought because Mr. Allbee was a member of the state legislature that I might find some correspondence related to that. That still might be a possibility, but my phone calls and emails have turned up nothing as of yet. But it would be fascinating to find out that, certainly that history. I suspect that at least some of the people that were labeled Copperheads and opposed the war may have had also possessed abolitionist sentiments, but I found no evidence of that, and I would like to see if I could find evidence of that, because it's in those contradictions where the exciting things of history happen, and I'll keep looking. I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfactory answer. I used a lot of words, but I'm not sure I answered your question, but I gave it a try.
Oh, that was good, Glenn. Grant, that was good. Glenn, do we have any other questions? I can't really tell on my screen.
Well, if anyone does, let me just scroll down and see if anyone's raised their hands. If anyone has a question that's here on Zoom with us, just unmute your mic and introduce yourself and ask Grant your question.
Those are two really good questions. I'm all worked up now.
Well, I have a question for you, Grant.
Sure.
Have you ever seen any other kind of tombstone in the Eastern Townships that has a political statement like that on it? I personally haven't seen anything, but I wondered if you had. No. No,
I've not, and you know, you probably guessed by now. I like wandering around cemeteries, so I've not seen one in Canada with a political statement like that. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but to make a statement like that at death is and put it on your headstone is incredibly rare. What makes it so interesting as well is as you saw it, there were 3 spelling mistakes in one sentence, right? And I asked myself, you know, as you know, this is the way that the mind of you know, my mind works. Was you know, did he write it out and make, you know, did Mr. Allbee write that out and make all those mistakes? Was his script so illegible that the person that made the carved the headstone, inscribed the headstone, did he just, you know, do it as he saw it and couldn't really read it, or did the person that carved the headstone you know, take it in and, you know, write it down, and his spelling might not have been, or I'm assuming it's a him, might not have been, you know, I shouldn't make assumptions, but their spelling might not have been as great as desired. But it just makes it so much more interesting because it is a political statement, and it's a statement written in you know, what we might call, you know, semi-literate English. So, but I can't imagine Eleazer making that error, because by all accounts he was a fairly learned man. So
yeah, I thought the same thing, and it's such a defiant stand. But
it is.
The spelling mistakes do sort of get in the way of that.
But defiance was what it was all about. You know, these men were really, these men and women were, and it's unfortunate that most of the documentation about the Copperhead movement comes to us from men, and that reflects the fact that well, there's a lot of reasons, I won't get into them, but it is unfortunate. But these men and women really believed in a vision of America that was just from another era, and they held on to it strongly. And I was just overwhelmed by just the boldness and the vigorousness at which they communicated their position.
Well, I think it's marvelous that you found that stone, because you know, I've never heard of it before. And when you were telling me about Mr. Allbee, I thought it was a marvelous story, and you really brought it to life for us. So thank you so much, Grant. It's really a wonderful tale that you've told us tonight. And I guess we're coming to the end of our presentation.
I see a question from Fergus, and maybe Matthew Parfan too.
Sure. Do we have time?
Yes, of course we do.
Okay, great.
Hey, Matthew, I think you're on.
Well, it's not a question, it's just a comment. Congratulations, Grant, on the, you started off by saying it was a work in progress. I'd say you'd made a hell of a good progress, and a lot of great original research went into that talk, and your enthusiasm for it really comes through. So really interesting.
Thank you very much. My own family has roots in the U.S. before we were invited to leave, and we had to come to Canada. So you know, the connection between Canada and the United States has always been something that's near and dear to my heart. So. Fergus. Yeah.
Fergus, just unmute yourself there. You're just muted. Yeah.
There we go.
I guess I'm unmuted now.
You're good.
Yeah, I guess it's just a general thought is that it would seem from the little reading I've done that Montreal was kind of a haven for the Confederacy That
Yes.
there was there was a famous bank robber where a bunch of guys leave Montreal, go into Vermont, hold up a bank, take some
Yeah,
money, come back
in
to Montreal.
St. Albans, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's always been the underlying current that perhaps Booth planned a kidnapping, well, originally the kidnapping of Lincoln, which ended up being an assassination, of course, in a hotel in Montreal.
Mhm.
It's quite interesting that Montreal seemed to have been a very, at least in certain sectors, kind of supporters of the whole Confederacy. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. You know, the United the Canada and well, Britain and by extension Canada at the time had an official position of neutrality on the war. The reality is that the continuation of the cotton industry in the American and tobacco industry in the American South benefited Britain greatly in terms of its trade and commerce. And so and this may be controversial for some people, but I will suggest that the war, and in particular the end of the slave system in the American South, and so central to the economy of the South, and by extension the economy of Great Britain. It probably wasn't in the best interest of Britain economically to see that system end. And so I think there was an official position of neutrality, but I think there was a lot of sympathy for a lot of different reasons for the American, the rebel states. There's also, and we have to come clean about this. We pride ourselves in Canada as saying, we didn't have slaves. Well, we've demonstrated that wasn't true, and I think we need to be quite honest in saying that there was probably a lot of ambivalence among Canadians at the time about slavery. If not outright, racist sentiments in some sectors. And I think we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize that it was a product of its time, and we have to recognize that maybe we don't want to continue that today, or we don't want to continue that today. We want to stand on the side of justice and equality, but we need to recognize it for what it was. And so Canada did play a role in the war, and that role peripherally, and that role may have benefited the South more than it benefited the North. And I hope somebody will challenge me on that, but that's the way I see it, at least at this point.
We have Rod. I see Rod has a question. We have a few more on Facebook too. Rod, why don't you go first?
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was just going to say that there's, it's interesting that Mr. Allbee very specifically referred to the president as his reason for coming to get away from the rule of the president. And as you say, it's a long tradition of people sort of denigrating the president as a tyrant and so forth, whatever age we're talking about. There's also a long tradition I've noticed in Canada. It's kind of a Canadian trait. Is it a Canadian trait or American trait? Anyway, it's a Canadian trait to notice this, that Americans are saying, oh, if so-and-so ever gets into power, I'm heading up to Canada.
Yes.
Certainly an uncle of mine who, for political reasons, hated Richard Nixon back in the 50s, said, if he ever comes to power, I'm heading up to Canada, which is where he was born, but still lit it up. But almost none of these people, at least in my experience, ever made it up. And if they, I know people who said this more recently, said it at the time of the Iraq War, said it at the time of Trump and so forth, and nobody ever comes. So I know, because I keep thinking, what do I have to put up with them if they come up here? So Mr. Allbee, did what others have only threatened to do. He actually, in the very, very end of his life, I mean, he may not have known that he had months to live, but
no,
that's quite a thing to do, right? I mean, I just wonder, what was he really making a statement? It seems like quite a statement. It's almost in your life to say, I'm not going for economic gain at this point, unless he was chased out by bad feelings at home. But it's almost like I'm really making a statement.
Mm-hmm. I think he was. I think he saw an option. I don't think. I think perhaps that he might not have made that move had he not had family in in Quebec. I think as well, and I'm beginning to suspect that by the time he left, a tolerance for the Copperheads like himself was beginning to run out, and I think the authorities were beginning to round some of these guys up and suppress what they felt were traitorous activities. This is especially true especially true in towards the end of the war, because the South was getting more desperate, and there were more rumors of possible organizing in Canada and raids into the North and all of these kinds of things. So at one point, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Lincoln suggested that he feared the war behind him rather than in front of him, and that was really what he really meant by that. Is I'm worried about the traitors in my own backyard more than defeating the Confederate Army. So. So I think he might have been afraid that his number might have been up. I'm not sure, but I'm beginning to think that. Yeah.
I see a few on Facebook there, Grant.
Sure.
I'll ask them together. Well, Lorraine wants to know, are you going to publish the story? And then David Edgell was wondering if there, I guess you've answered the question, are there any Albee descendants in the townships?
No, and that's really interesting. So most of the Albees had kind of died off, and they're by time Eleazer had gone up to Canada. His parents had died. His siblings had married Americans and gone back to the United States. His older brother at the time, who was a noted businessman, and I'm trying to remember his name. I think he might have been Alonzo or something like that. He had died, and even George Henry at one point sold the farm, packed up, and moved back to New England. I think it was Boston, perhaps. I can't remember exactly, and died. So I don't think there are any of those Albees around anymore. But if I'm wrong, I'd be glad to know, happy to know about it. In terms of publishing, yeah, I would like to do it. It needs to be cleaned up a little bit, but that's the goal. Yeah.
I sort of have a question here, Grant. Just from having known some people that live just across from Stanstead and that kind of border region, I find often there's sort of this, and I don't live in the township, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, this comfort that people take in that sort of Northeast Kingdom region or just Northern Vermont about living close to Canada in case things, and I know Vermont has a strong independent political tradition, but
yes.
I feel like it's almost like a cultural thing there that, oh, well, we're close to Canada, and if worst comes to worst, we can just jump the border.
I think many people on the border, and I know many of them. Some may be with us here tonight. I think many people on the border have dual citizenship, first of all, and they can jump the border from one side to the other. I think many people that don't still feel a strong sense of affinity. Matthew and I think Tim is with us here tonight as well, Tim Bagley. We went to a funeral a few years ago. It was a Masonic funeral, and it was supposed to be held in the Stanstead South United Church. And this was an American man that lived on Derby Line on the American side. Correct me if I'm wrong about the details, Matthew. But he attended church in Stanstead, and so he wanted his funeral to be there. And we couldn't have the funeral because so many of his family did not have passports and they couldn't come over. And I think for many years, the families on the border have considered themselves, on either side of the border, the people have considered themselves one people, and they've acted as one community, and they've interacted with each other. And in the, particularly since the incidents of that we call 9/11, I think a lot of the sense of community on either side of the border has been undermined by the measures associated with the Patriot Act. And I'm not going to criticize the American authorities for that, but I'm going to say that it's sad that these border communities that felt as one, that ability is now being undermined.
Well, I think that may be it now, Grant. We can bring the evening to a close. It's been a fantastic discussion, though. Thank you, everybody, for asking your questions. And Grant, you're so thorough with your answers. So I do hope you do publish this.
You mean long-winded?
Yeah, no. Not at all. Not at all. No, it's been great. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, too. It's great to have your support and supporting our speakers, too. And I hope you join us for our next presentation, which is coming up this Sunday, February 21st, in the afternoon from 1 to 2. So take note of that. It's an afternoon presentation by Jody Robinson called Colonization Efforts of the 20th Century, Lawrence Colony Revisited. So that sounds interesting and mysterious. Yeah. So,
yes.
So thank you again so much for everything that you did, Grant. It's a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Glenn, in Master Control, as always. And thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.